Hello, so this video is going to be all about drugs. Specifically, we're going to talk about a couple different classes of drugs and a couple examples of each. So the three classes of drugs that we're going to talk about are 1, depressants, 2, stimulants, and 3, hallucinogens. So we'll start with depressants. Probably the most commonly used depressant is alcohol. Now, all depressants work by reducing the activity of the central nervous system. Alcohol does the same thing. Now, if you're using alcohol in moderate amounts, it can tend to have positive social consequences. So it tends to relieve anxiety. And when I say low or moderate amounts, I mean like maybe 1 drink a day. But if you start using alcohol excessively, so using it more highly, then it can start having health consequences. One of the health consequences that some may care about especially is it can trigger apoptosis, or active cell death. It can literally cause your neurons to destroy themselves. All right. Now it does that, or one of the ways it does this is by basically disrupting the activity of the mitochondria. So if you remember from your biology classes, in your neuron, or in all cells really, you have a mitochondria, and those mitochondria are basically the power plants of the cell. Alcohol can trigger apoptosis, active cell death, by disrupting the function of the mitochondria, making them less capable of doing their job, which can trigger the situation where the cell basically kills itself, apoptosis. Also, there was some work suggesting that alcohol could have positive health effects for cardiovascular health. This work has been disconfirmed. Specifically, the work showing that alcohol could have a positive effect was quasi-experimental in nature. Now, what that means is that they didn't use random assignment. They didn't randomly assign people to a drinking condition and others to a non-drinking condition. Rather, they used a natural groups design, specifically, which is quasi-experimental. Specifically, they looked at the cardiovascular health of people who drank versus the cardiovascular health of people who didn't. Now, that work is essentially correlational. So the positive benefits that were attributed to alcohol after the release of that study were really unfounded to begin with, because it was correlational. But because of it using a natural groups design and not assigning people to drink or not, the positive benefits that it revealed were largely confounded by the fact that people in the non-drinking condition, some of them were already not drinking because of health issues that already existed. Their poor health would pull down the average health of the non-drinking group. So a meta-analysis in 2011 revealed that there are actually no positive health benefits of alcohol use. So yeah, I know those of you who really like alcohol and maybe even pointed to the fact that, hey, drinking's good for your heart. It's not. There are no health benefits of alcohol. There are certain social benefits of moderate and light alcohol use, like I said, lower anxiety, but there are no positive health benefits of alcohol use. Now, other depressants include barbiturates, tranquilizers like Valium and Xanax, and opiates like morphine and heroin. But all of these work in the same basic way. They work to reduce the activity of the central nervous system. Next, stimulants. This is the second class of drugs that we're going to talk about. Now, a couple different examples of stimulants are caffeine, nicotine, amphetamines, and cocaine. But all of these work by doing the exact opposite of what depressants do. So depressants work to reduce activity in the central nervous system. Stimulants act to increase the activity in the central nervous system. So, caffeine is probably the most commonly abused stimulant. Certainly, I admit, I abuse it. And in fact, there are memes all over social media that would probably argue that the majority of people abuse, or a lot of people abuse caffeine, but it serves to increase neural activity. So largely, many of us use it for waking up in the morning. Some of us, oddly enough, like the taste. But the point remains that this is a stimulant. Nicotine. Nicotine is a stimulant commonly found in cigarettes. Now, nicotine, just like every other stimulant, works to increase neural activity, but the activity that it increases is in cells that produce dopamine and norepinephrine. Now, dopamine is a neurotransmitter that's commonly associated with reward processing. So when dopamine is released, we often feel good. And so nicotine, which is found in cigarettes, can often make us feel good. And this is one reason why people get addicted. In fact, nicotine is as addictive as drugs such as cocaine and heroin. Now, and part of the reason quitting smoking is so hard, is so difficult, is because remember that homeostasis function that I mentioned in another video. Basically, as you smoke and more dopamine is released, as you become dependent on it, your body or your brain produces less and less and less dopamine. So when you quit smoking, your brain isn't producing the same amounts of dopamine. It's relying on the nicotine to produce it. So when the nicotine isn't there to stimulate the dopamine release, your brain experiences an absence of dopamine, which can lead to very depressing symptoms. Smoking or withdrawal symptoms can feel saddening. They can also basically, remember, so if you review my video over tolerance and physical withdrawal symptoms, remember that withdrawal symptoms are usually the exact opposite of whatever the original effects of the drug are. So, if dopamine makes you feel good by releasing dopamine, when you quit smoking, you tend to feel bad. And you tend to feel, whereas it may originally make you feel relaxed, it's not smoking tends to make you feel anxious. So quitting smoking is hard for a couple of reasons. One, when you're not smoking, you're not getting the relaxing experience. And two, when you do smoke, not only do you get that relaxing experience, but you also get a relief of the withdrawal symptoms. So quitting smoking can be especially hard. Another kind of stimulant is amphetamines, like crystal meth, and then cocaine. So whereas nicotine causes dopamine to be released, cocaine tends to prevent dopamine from being reuptaken. So cocaine works by dopamine, but it prevents it from being reuptaken. And interestingly enough, cocaine can inadvertently cause dopamine, basically dopamine deletion. Basically, it can cause less dopamine to be present in your brain. Now, part of the way it does that is because the cells become better at metabolizing it. So the dopamine gets metabolized quicker through your neurons when taking dopamine. But cocaine is among one of the most abused stimulants. Now, the last drug that or class of drugs that I wanted to talk about were hallucinogens. So one very common hallucinogen is LSD. Now, LSD, if you're a fan of history at all, was popularized during the 60s and 70s, during the hippie era. LSD wasn't illegal at the time, and it tended to create this euphoric sense of selflessness. Basically, the experience of the self kind of dissolved, and there seemed to be a greater sense of communion with those around you. In fact, if you were to go back and watch documentaries about people taking LSD back during the 60s and 70s, you would often hear them describe about this experience of greater oneness with those around them. LSD also tends to lead to, in addition to the hallucinogenic experiences, a heightened emotionality. Another type of mild hallucinogen is THC. THC is the active ingredient in marijuana. Now, it has the effect of amplifying certain sensory experiences like colors and sounds and tastes and smells. It also disinhibits and relaxes. And so marijuana has been used in a medicinal sense for certain anxiety-based conditions. Now, much of the work in the past has argued that marijuana is not destructive, or at least not as destructive as more legal, commonly used drugs like nicotine and alcohol. But its destructive nature is somewhat in debate right now, because some work is coming out showing that prolonged use of marijuana can be harmful. Specifically, prolonged use, like 20 years or greater, is associated with shrinkage of the neural areas responsible for memory. Also, among those who began using marijuana prior to the age of 18, there's a correlation with lower IQ scores, later in life. Specifically, those who use marijuana more tend to have lower IQ scores. Who use marijuana more prior to the age of 18 tend to have lower IQ scores later. Now, again, that's correlational, so whether that's causal or not, it could be entirely, there could be some third variable, specifically the disinhibition and relaxation caused by marijuana may lead them to study less, read less, which could then result in lower IQ scores. So the mechanism by which it operates may not be causal, but this is some of the evidence that's coming up showing that marijuana isn't as harmless as it has been touted as being in the past. All right, guys, that's all I wanted to talk about on this video. So we talked about 3 different kinds of drugs. We talked about depressants, we talked about stimulants, and we talked about hallucinogens, and we talked about several examples of each. The examples that we focused on for each we talked about alcohol primarily with depressants, we talked about nicotine and cocaine largely with stimulants, and we talked about LSD and THC primarily with regards to hallucinogens. That's it for this video. If you have any questions, please send them my way. Other than that, take it easy.